Star Trek fans celebrate in a Toronto hotel as they look to the distant future. But some of those fans are still confronted by the ugly realities of the 20th century.
Hello and welcome to DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit.
And I'm Joe Coughlin. The biggest Star Trek convention ever held in Canada proved to be a humiliating experience for some of the fans. We'll meet three of them in a moment.
People who stutter are still the butt of many jokes. Later, we'll hear how they react to the way they're treated and how they can deal with the difficulties they have communicating.
We'll also look at the way wheelchair marathoners are treated by the media. In parts of the country, they are given the same coverage as other sports figures. In other areas, they are ignored.
But first, here's this week's roundup of disability news.
The Minister of National Health and Welfare, Benoit Bouchard, announced this week that $46 million will be spent on disability initiatives. The announcements represent Health and Welfare Canada's share of the federal 5-year strategy on disability announced last month. The projects are a combination of ongoing and new initiatives. Among the areas to be targeted: developing and implementing new models to improve integration for disabled persons into the community and workforce. Projects to address the problem of child abuse, including sexual abuse. Integrating special needs children into daycare services. And expanding job rehabilitation measures to help recipients of Canada Pension Plan disability benefits re-enter the workforce.
There are 700,000 disabled women in Ontario, and half of them were sexually assaulted as children. A full 83% will be sexually assaulted during their lifetimes. These statistics come from a report on sexual assault against women with disabilities that was prepared by the Disabled Women's Network in Toronto.
How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole?
This is a healing song for disabled women who have been sexually assaulted. The Disabled Women's Network says that sexual assaults take place against disabled women because they are one of the most vulnerable groups in society. In their report, the network says that victims are not treated fairly by either the police or the legal system.
Now, this report is not, shall we say, happy bedtime reading. It is a painful report, and I hope it will be treated with the respect that it should be given.
Among the main recommendations of the report, police, lawyers, and the judiciary should be re-educated concerning disabled women and the specific problems they face, and the province should take a more active role in publicizing disability issues.
25 years after the fact, the federal government has finally compensated Canadian victims of thalidomide. The compensation is a lot less than expected. Rick Ratty reports.
It takes Paul Murphy twice as long and twice the money to do what able-bodied people do. To drive this truck, he's had to spend thousands of dollars for special equipment. Recently, the federal government said it would spend $9.5 million to compensate Murphy and other thalidomide victims across Canada.
By now, the whole world knows the tragedy of thalidomide.
Thalidomide is a drug introduced in West Germany in the 1950s and 60s. It was a tranquilizer for pregnant women. It had tragic side effects. In spite of what was happening in West Germany, the drug was released in Canada. Birth defects soon showed up here. The Canadian government said it would compensate the nearly 120 people who suffered. After a 25-year battle, the government has come through.
We were hoping it would have been more, but...
How much were you hoping it would be?
We've had all sorts of numbers. We were talking at one point in the 19 to 20 mark, but I mean, what we've got is going to help out. There's no question about that.
Murphy says the $9.5 million will be distributed in 3 packages. $1 million will be used to set up support programs, although those programs have not yet been defined. $4.5 million will be divided equally among all thalidomide victims, about $30,000 each.
The remaining $4.5 million will be paid to thalidomide victims according to the severity of their disability. Those with severe handicaps, for instance loss of both arms and legs, could receive as much as $100,000.
Murphy says the settlement was accepted by 83% of Canada's thalidomide victims.
Sooner or later, you got to, get on with life and continue along. You can fight all the time, and it doesn't get you anywhere. What was needed right now is money into people's hands. So, satisfied. I'm satisfied that there's money.
Thalidomide victims could receive their first check within weeks. Murphy says the government has promised the remainder of the package will be distributed before April. Rick Ratty, CBC News, Winnipeg.
A Baltimore group opposed to the portrayal of a blind man on the ABC network sitcom Good and Evil is stepping up its campaign to have the character rewritten or the show canceled. The National Federation of the Blind complained about a recent episode in which the blind character George entered a laboratory wildly swinging a cane. George practically demolished the lab, fondled a man he thought was a woman, and made a sexual pass at a coat rack. James Gashel, a spokesman for the Federation, says that the portrayal only adds to the misconceptions society has about the blind.
The character George plays upon all of the stereotypes, the worst stereotypes that people hold concerning blindness, and emphasizes the worst characteristics that most people believe as far as blind people are concerned. It's an entirely negative portrayal of blind people. Now, although it's an extreme use of these stereotypes, to one degree or another, it's believable for a lot of people, and that's why we object to it.
ABC TV issued a statement calling the series an exaggerated parody of life. Not one character in this series is intended to be realistic or believable.
And that's this week's roundup of disability news.
Coming up next, disabled Star Trek fans encounter familiar 20th century obstacles. We're back with our story about the Star Trek convention and what happened to some of the people who took part. Elaine Hewitt and her sister Cheryl have come from their hometown of Peterborough, Ontario to join fellow Trekkers in celebrating the 25th anniversary of the enormously popular television and film series. This year's Toronto Trek 5 was held in the space-age-looking Regal Constellation Hotel, which, as it turned out, was not as futuristic as some would have liked. The big draw at the convention was Walter Koenig, who plays Chekhov in the original series and in the Star Trek movies.
These people have a diversified enthusiasms and diversified background, and they do interesting things with their lives that involve other things as well.
Did Commander Riker...
In fact, fans insist the Star Trek movement, as they call it, is not just a bunch of weirdos dressed in strange costumes.
The Star Trek movement started off saying it didn't matter what sex or what color you were. It's now in the next generation extended to saying it doesn't matter if you're bald and it doesn't matter if you're visually impaired, because it's got Geordi, a blind navigator, is actually navigating the ship and he's blind. And they said he's got a prosthetic and he's able to overcome his disabilities. So the whole Star Trek philosophy says that disability shouldn't hold you back. There are things that we can do to make up for disabilities and assist you in doing whatever it is you want to do. And people love that dream.
For people who came in wheelchairs, people such as Cheryl Hewitt and her sister Elaine, the Star Trek dream bears no relation to the reality of a not untypical 20th century Canadian hotel. The ramps leading to all the fun are a case in point.
Well, basically we just find them too steep, and this one behind us in particular has a lip at the bottom and a lip at the top, so you have to be really careful that you don't tip as you're coming down or going up. At the bottom, if you're going too fast, you're going to put yourself right out on your face. I get a lot of spasticity in my hips and it pushes me back, and so the weight is more in the back of the chair. So if you're going up a steep ramp, it tends to tip the chair back. So you have to be real careful when you're using a ramp like that, because you could tip your chair right over backwards. If I start to tip, she can catch me, and the weight of her chair, because it's powered, like I won't fall over because she can catch me, and it won't push her over because her chair is so much heavier.
Watching Trek bloopers is a popular attraction at these Trek conventions. The problem was, the usually packed screening room in this hotel is at the top of 2 flights of stairs. This barrier to a full enjoyment of the convention was condemned by Sandy Marie McLaughlin of Ottawa, who is no stranger to science fiction conventions.
It's the worst I've ever seen. I've been attending conventions for 15 years minimum. I've never seen this before. It's unbelievable. I can't even imagine a hotel that would have absolutely no access, at least by freight elevator. But there's nothing. I can't believe it. Most conventions are getting geared up for the handicap. There hasn't been a lot of handicapped people coming to conventions, but I think with the new availability, the new access to the community, there are more handicapped people coming out to various functions, and the conventions are becoming geared up to handle this thing. This situation here is a direct result of a failure in communications.
Okay, Cheryl, maybe so that you can get your chair as close to the bed as possible. Go in between the bed.
And how about this situation?
When we phoned originally to register, we told them that we were both in wheelchairs, that we would need wheelchair access. And they said there would be no problem. They had wheelchair accessible rooms and the whole thing. So we were expecting everything to be wonderful when we got here. And then we got into the room, we couldn't get between the beds, so it's just been a headache.
You had to leave your wheelchair somewhere near the end of the bed, and if you could crawl to the bed and get in.
There was 2 double beds, and there was just a narrow aisleway down the middle between them, and so you couldn't move them because they were attached to the wall and the floor, so there was no way to move them. We had to crawl in between on the aisleway and then pull ourselves up onto the bed.
I think this will hold me.
Yeah, probably. You okay?
Yeah.
I'm here anyways. Well, I find it a little degrading. Really, I think most other people, you know, they wouldn't like having to crawl across the floor to get where they had to go. And I just think that to call this room wheelchair accessible is an injustice.
It's the first time we went to the Constellation Hotel, this hotel. So we thought it was accessible, and it bills itself as being accessible. And so when you get there, you sometimes find out that things are not always what they say they are. So a lot of places that do say they're accessible aren't really accessible, or accessible with difficulty in this city.
Joe, that scene in the hotel bedroom was really shocking.
It sure was. I know from experience that kind of inaccessibility is all too common in the country's hotels. But things are improving slowly. In fact, right now, we are preparing a story about an old and famous Canadian hotel which has gone to a lot of trouble and expense to make itself totally accessible. We'll bring it to you in a future program.
Coming up, stuttering. Is it really a disability?
We're back to talk about a disability that few of us really understand and too many of us laugh at, stuttering. Fortunately, there's been a lot of progress towards understanding the disability in recent years, thanks in part to the efforts of people who stutter. This summer, self-help groups got together in Banff and formed a new national organization. It's called the Canadian Network for People Who Stutter. Shefali Sujani spoke with one of the leaders of this new consumer movement about the progress that has taken place. Shefali is a new member of the DNET team. First of all, let me welcome you here.
Thank you, Joe. It's good to be here. There are 125,000 people in Canada who stutter. Jaan Pill is one of them. He's a member of the new national group. You'll notice in my interview with him that he speaks in a very slow, measured way. That's part of the process of controlling his stutter.
Mr. Pill, I think most people would be surprised to hear that stuttering is a disability. Is it, in fact, an official disability?
It certainly is considered to be a disability in certain employment situations. For example, in the federal government, if you go for an employment interview and you happen to be a person who stutters, that can be taken into account as a speech disability. And in fact, it's one of the few disabilities where people still make fun of a disability. For example, in movies and so on, if a person is blind or deaf or in a wheelchair, they're not considered to be fair game for jokes or to be the butt of jokes. But people who stutter still are the butt of jokes sometimes. Perhaps the most devastating impact is simply the fact that a person doesn't talk as much as they would otherwise. So many social opportunities and just the kinds of things that we learn by talking with people, a person who stutters can easily miss out on that. So they miss out on all kinds of employment opportunities, educational opportunities. They tend, in many cases, to simply withdraw from the mainstream of life.
Do people actually understand the causes of stuttering?
Well, for a long time, people assumed that it was either an emotional or psychological disorder. But right now, we have understanding that it's a neuropsychological disorder. It has to do with how the brain hemispheres function. And the research in this area is becoming quite strong.
How come you don't stutter?
Well, I consider myself to be a person who stutters. I haven't been cured of stuttering. How I got help was I went through a couple of intensive treatment programs. And until that point, I couldn't speak a full sentence without stuttering, and I had a lot of difficulty. But as a result of treatment, and as a result of practicing every day, and as a result of putting myself into situations where I have to speak and apply my fluency skills, I'm able to speak with quite a bit of fluency.
How difficult is it to find out about what's available for people who stutter?
It takes a bit of research on the part of people who have an interest. For example, you have to find a program that is intensive, which means, for example, for adults, you should be looking at a 3-week intensive program where you spend maybe 10 or 12 hours a day working on your speech. If you simply go 1 day a week for 1 hour or 1 hour every 2 weeks, it's not really very effective for stuttering, but that is a kind of approach that many school boards in Canada still take, for example, with children and adolescents. But progress is being made towards intensive programs, but to find them, you certainly have to look for them, and if you can't find them, you have to lobby for them.
Jaan Pill is a member of the Canadian Network for People Who Stutter. It was formed this summer when more than a dozen self-help groups got together at a conference in Banff, Alberta. He was interviewed by Shafali Sajani. If you want more information on the Canadian Network, write to us. We'll give you our address at the end of the show.
Ahead on DNet, media looks the other way as disabled athletes cross the finish line.
Disabled athletes took part in a major marathon in Toronto last week. It was a joint effort of the Ontario Track and Field Association and the Canadian Wheelchair Sports Association. It had several big corporate sponsors, including Shoppers Drug Mart. And guess what? Most of the media, including at least one CBC News program, ignored the disabled athletes.
The 3 Toronto dailies had virtually no coverage. The Sun listed 1,445 able-bodied male runners, including their times, and it lists 249 female runners and their times. After looking at this huge list of names, you still wouldn't know that wheelchair racers even took part in the marathon. Canada's self-styled national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, ran a story on the marathon but ignored the disabled competitors. The only paper that listed the winners without their times was the Star. The electronic media's coverage was no better.
In fact, 25 top wheelchair athletes competed in the race. The event also doubled as the National Wheelchair Marathon Championship. Athletes taking part were from across Canada and Europe. In the men's division, Dan Wesley of New Westminster British Columbia took top spot. He was followed by Doug White of Lanceville, BC, and Michelle Juneau of Val-d'Or, Quebec. In the women's division, Connie Hansen of Denmark came in first. She was followed by Daniela Utzeler of Switzerland.
While the media chose to ignore disabled marathoners racing in Toronto, they are taken seriously in the province of Quebec. For example, coverage of wheelchair racers in past events, such as the Montreal Marathon, was extensive in both the print and electronic media. In fact, one wheelchair marathoner in particular has become a household name to many people in Quebec. Andre Viger has just retired from the sport. The following report from Montreal is by Scott Russell.
I've written a book, says Andre Viger. His fans hang on his every word. It's a book about my life, an autobiography of sport, but it's something more. It's a romance, says Viger. For 15 years, Andre Viger's romance was the marathon. 3 victories in Boston, 4 in Japan, a bronze medal at the '84 Los Angeles Olympics in the 1500 meters, and most importantly to Viger, 3 victories in the Montreal Marathon.
I feel like I did what I wanted to do. I realized my dream, you know.
Andre Viger has made others dream too. People like his longtime friend and manager, Roger Mondor.
Viger for the last 3 years was the star of the Montreal Marathon. You know, like many people told me that they watched the marathon on TV, but after Viger was in, they turned it off.
Oddly, Viger's dreams were realized after a nightmarish car accident 18 years ago. The use of his legs gone, he gained a spirit that helped him become an athletic hero to many Quebecers and Canadians.
I think the people looking at us more like an athlete, a complete athlete, instead a wheelchair athlete, you know.
Now at 39, Viger will turn his attention to remembering, to his wheelchair business in Montreal, and to his constant struggle to help other athletes like him.
I am proud because the sport is alive here in Quebec and in Canada now.
It's really beyond the wheelchair people. Andre brought wheelchair sport the recognition that Maurice Richard and Lafleur brought to hockey.
Which means around here, Andre Viger qualifies as a superstar. No questions asked. Scott Russell, CBC Sports, Montreal.
What do you think about media coverage of disabled sports? Have you been let down by your local press? Drop us a letter in the mail or fax us. We'll give you our address and number at the end of the show.
Speaking of letters, I have a response to last week's program on the National Strategy for the Integration of Persons with Disabilities. It comes from Mel Pozazorski, who lives in Toronto. Dear Susan and Joe, you presented the pros and cons of the federal initiative of $158 million for the disabled. As a person with a disability, I see only cons, no pros. That amount of money over 5 years is a drop in the bucket. To mention that in the same breath with the American Disabilities legislation is an insult to the American legislation. What Brian Mulrooney announced was for purely political reasons and shows no real understanding of or commitment to disabled issues.
Actually, Sue, we didn't say the federal government's strategy resembled the Americans with Disabilities Act, which it doesn't, except in the very broadest sense. What we did say is that the disabled community itself is designing a legislative package similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which it will present to the Mulroney government. Remember, we're looking for your letters. If you have any comments on items in this week's show or last week's, write to us.
One final thing. If you have a camera or video recorder, send us videos or photographs that illustrate the most inaccessible piece of architecture in your area.
Like one of the ramps we showed on DNet last season. Send a video or a photo of something with a little twist, something that strikes you as being bizarre.
The best entry of the week will win a DNet t-shirt.
Yes, in all sizes, by the way.
Or one of these caps.
Black or in white. And that's our show. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. See you again next week.
Bye-bye. Now here's our address. You can write to us at Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station 8, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or you can fax us at area code 416-975-5636.